I think it's a beautiful film to look at, and I think the score is really beautiful. But 15 seconds in, I know we're in trouble because of how fucking long it takes to get through those credits. That's just an indication of, like, what's wrong with this thing. Like, it's just totally sleepy. I have a very specific memory of being under that overpass, shooting the scene with Peter and Allison, and just thinking, okay, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, you know, I want to be in Baton Rouge with a crew of 5 people, like, making something, using the same sort of methodology that I used when I started making films. Like, I was already absent. It's a very unpleasant feeling to know that, not be able to discuss that with anybody, and see everybody working so hard, the cast and the crew, to give you what you want every day, and you know this thing's just dead on arrival. I resolved during that this is never gonna happen to me again. And by the time we finished shooting, I'd hatched the plan to go and make Schizopolis. So I was using that time on the set when I should have been thinking about what I was doing, kind of fantasizing about what I was going to be doing when it was over.
It's too painful.
I won't make that mistake again. I promise.
I can't say that I would recommend it to anyone other than to look at it in the context of a career, and that it actually fulfilled a very important function for me, because I was so unhappy coming out of it that I decided I needed to radically alter my way of working. So in a way, I needed to, you know, to borrow a phrase, I needed to bottom out in order to rebuild.
I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is I have till Tuesday to cough it up. The bad news is I have till Tuesday to cough it up.
I'm sure it's awful for anybody who worked on the film to hear me dissing it. And there are a lot of people in the film, you know, Peter's a good friend of mine. This was one of the first things that Allison Elliott did, and I really liked her a lot. Bill Fichtner, you know, Paul Dooley, Anjanette Comer, Adam Tracy, Elizabeth Shue. Like, I had everything I needed. You know, like I said, I'm the one who didn't show up. There's for me to understand that I needed to make Schizopolis, but that's kind of what happened. Generic greeting.
Generic greeting returned.
Imminent sustenance.
Overly dramatic statement regarding upcoming meal.
Ooh, false reaction indicating hunger and excitement. The first 4 films are all very different from each other, but I think what they have in common is a sort of increasing formality they were all very necessary parts of my development. You know, I learned a lot on each of them. You know, Kafka and The Underneath, I think, are the least well-regarded of those first 4, which is fair. The mistakes in Kafka are the classic mistakes of a young filmmaker, which is inconsistency of tone. I never figured out exactly what the tone was, and I think wasn't paying attention to that as much as I should have been. It was physically a sort of larger movie, obviously, than my first film, and I was very conscious of the craft of it all. And I think that was at the expense of really analyzing the screenplay and figuring out what the tone of it was. I'd written in order to get into the business, and I'd had the good fortune to have a success early, right out of the gate, with something that I'd written, but that was kind of masking the fact that I wasn't really a writer in the sense that I consider real writers to be writers. And there's no question in my mind that subsequent to these first 4 films, especially when I got into the sort of Out of Sight period and beyond, and I started working with writers, that the work got much, much better very quickly.
What business could we possibly have together?
A job.
A job. A job?
I'd always been interested in crime films, and specifically in heist film that I made for Gramercy at Universal. And that was, again, the great thing about that, the key if you can orchestrate this, is to be making your movie at the same time that the studio's making a sort of legendary, out-of-control production. Because while we were shooting The Underneath, Universal was making Waterworld. And we couldn't even get anyone on the phone from Texas when we were shooting. So we were completely on our own, which was nice. I mean, that was I like being left alone, but that, I remember specifically when we had questions or needed something, we just literally couldn't get anybody on the phone. I think if I were to see it now, I'd recognize that there was some brain activity going on. And then, you know, Joe Crest comes in, and there's this extended scene in which you just don't know what is going on. That I remember being excited about. And we'd also built this, Howard Cummings had built, I'd never done this before, a forced perspective hallway. That hallway is actually super short. I told him, because of the point of view issue, you know, you're only ever going to see it from this angle. He goes, oh, great, well, then I'll do one of these. And that was, you know, that was a fun trick. But at least that to me had some qualities in it that were cinematic, that were fun. It was very helpful, I think, in this case, for me to have, you know, Stan Salfas there with me. I think it would be even worse if he weren't. We may have almost beat Don Siegel's record for the least amount of exposed footage on a feature film. 62,000 feet of negative were exposed on The Underneath. And I think I think like on one of his, you know, Clint movies, he was right around there or near below. That's anybody who knows about any of this kind of stuff will gasp when they hear that figure. We were finishing The Underneath. Gilles Jacob called me and said, would you be interested in having the film in the festival? And I go, it's the worst thing I ever made. I'm not even going to screen it for you. And he just laughed. He goes, I've never heard anybody say that to me, ever. I go, well, it was so weird. It was such a classic ending to that whole experience. The film was literally falling apart in the lab. The splices on the negative were falling apart. Like, that's how much this movie doesn't hold together. There were only 22 prints made of that film. To their credit, nobody from Universal ever said anything to me. I think in order to continue to evolve, you have to keep kind of annihilating things that have come before and kind of destroying what you just did. And so even though in the past few years, let's say maybe from Che on, but certainly post-Che, up until very recently, there's been a sort of consistent approach stylistically that I've been playing with that in a superficial way you'd think would be connected to the earlier films in the sense of not a lot of handheld stuff unless, you know, absolutely necessary, and very, very simple, very clean compositions, the editing is very, you know, taking an approach that if you added one more shot, that would be too many. If you took one shot out, you'd be losing something, just being really, really tough with stuff in a way that I couldn't be if I hadn't made those other films, killed them off, and then rebuilt on top of them. And so what I see when I look at the first 4 films is like version 1 of a certain style that wasn't really fully matured yet, and that later on, and Che really started this because the time constraints were so severe that you had to just be as simple as possible. You really only got two angles on a scene and a couple of takes, and you had to move on. And that, I took that from that experience and started applying it to other things, and really analyzing scenes after they were blocked and saying, well, instead of thinking how many shots I need, how few shots do I need? At the end of the day, if there's one thing that the audience needs to pull from this, what is it? And I think that what I see a lot is material in which I don't know whose point of view the scene is being told from. That's really the way to simplify. If having to get through something, in an efficient manner, the first thing you should be asking yourself is, well, whose scene is this? Whose point of view is this scene from? Because if it turns out that from a story standpoint, it's really important that you understand X character's reaction to what is happening in this scene, really, in my view, have to convince me that it shouldn't be done that way before you go off and do it some other way. That question, that sort of kind of almost dogmatic approach to point of view is something, like I said, that was born out of the experience of Che, because you just didn't have time to sort of cover things. You really just had to determine, the answer most of the time was, well, it's Che's scene. But it really forced me to go, okay, what's the essence of this? And that's what we're going for. It's really hard for me to, if I look at the first four movies, the success of Sex Lies was a surprise. The failure of Kafka was not. King of the Hill could have gone one way, could have gone another. Hard to say. I think it's a very accessible movie, certainly, not an obscure sort of art project. So who's to say if it had come out at a different time and we'd figured out how to sell it, if that might have worked. The Underneath wasn't going to work. So it was hard. I certainly didn't come out of that situation blaming the audience the way I do now. I blame them now. I didn't blame them back then. A lot's changed in 20 years. They sort of get what they pay for. Look, the Hollywood movie business, for lack of a better term, is it's all economic forces, And so if people suddenly decided that, adult-themed sort of movies were the new blockbuster, then that's all they'd be making. I mean, they're just following, they're not leading. And I think it's clear that in the last decade or so, what audiences want from the movies has changed. It's just changed. And that is what it is, And if you're just interested in telling stories, then go where you feel like you can tell your stories. I don't view it with anything. I look at it and just go, my job as a filmmaker is to adapt. If I don't adapt, I die. That's the way nature works. So I've just got to, instead of spending my time going, why didn't more people go see Side Effects? What I should be spending my time doing is this 10-hour television thing that I'm doing, which I'm really enjoying. That's a good use of my time.